Well, hey everyone. I've already kind of done my spiel on who I am. But one thing before you ask, I still write code. I know a lot of solution architects don't, but I think it's important. This is my first time giving this talk. Actually, first time ever speaking at a meetup. So if there's any bumps along the way, I appreciate your patience. And yeah, I've mentioned before, I've built software across a variety of industries, worked in a lot of ERP systems and programming languages that probably predate half this room, and working on mobile apps and wastewater treatment plants. And while I could tell you about how poop water becomes drinking water, because it's actually quite fascinating, I'll save those stories for another day. Instead, I want to talk to you about how frustrating writing software can be at times. I'm sure you all know those moments. For me, they usually involve me yelling at my computer, wondering why nothing works the way it should, while simultaneously cursing the person that wrote it. Only to find out, while trawling through the Git log, that person was me. It's kind of those things that make you question all the life decisions that led you to this moment. We've all been there, right? And one would think that experience would shield you from these mistakes, and that after years of writing and reviewing code, you would have it all figured out. But instead, I've actually noticed something else. Writing software has gotten harder, not easier. Early in my career, I could write for code for hours and hours on end, forgetting all basic human needs like water and food, though somehow my coffee cup never went empty. The solutions just flowed. I felt like I was John Carmack, minus the genius part. And I really miss those times. Programming used to be an escape for me, a place where I could have fun. I could build things and feel creative. It was a place to assert some sort of control in an unpredictable world. Remember when you first started coding? That pure joy of making something work? That excitement when you built your first app? When the focus was just on solving the problems? Framework you've learned and all the different complexities you've had to deal with. Now, I spend entire days agonizing over architectural decisions for code that I haven't even written yet. It's as if the more I've learned, the more paralyzed I've become. All these patterns and best practices swirling around in my head, like a nagging teacher making me second guess every decision I've made. And look, the irony is not lost on me. What began as a liberating, creative outlet has been weighed down by its own complexity. Each line of code now carries the burden of a multitude of considerations. How do I make this scalable? How do I make this maintainable? Oh shit, I need to test it as well. Concepts that once felt empowering and fun for me now feel like chains holding me back. I don't think I'm alone in feeling this way. And that's what I want to explore today. Why has writing software become so complicated? And more importantly, how do we get back to the simple joy of building things? And actually, let's take you back to a particularly humbling moment in my career. One that makes me cringe when I still think about it, because it's actually pretty embarrassing. See, at the time, I was building a tablet app for an asset managers and field technicians. And I got tasked with creating an iOS view. It had to navigate an asset hierarchy with basic features like search and select, and expand and collapse over a parent-child relationship. Nothing too complicated. But having worked for this client for a while, I knew they had a shit ton of data. So I figured performance was going to be a real challenge in this one. Probably could have used Satvik's talk. Naturally, I dusted off my old algorithm data structures book, you know the one, from university that somehow survived every house move. And after hours of research, I felt like I'd chosen the right data structure and was on my way to the perfect solution. I spent days, if not weeks, building this masterpiece, even writing my own binary search tree implementation, because why not? Maybe looking back, I was probably trying to get revenge on some old university assignment, but who knows? And just before I was heading off on holidays, I pushed my code and feeling incredibly proud of what I had built. And while I was away channeling my inner Alex Honnold, a bug appeared. A colleague stepped in and tried to fix it. Keyword here, he tried. He couldn't make heads or tails of it. And honestly, I don't blame him. My code was complex, it was dense, and looking back now, completely unnecessary. With the project on the deadline, the owner of the company got involved. You know what he did? He deleted my entire solution. Just deleted it. All of it. Gone. And to really drive the point home, he replaced my masterpiece with a simple dictionary-based implementation and solved the problem in 30 minutes. It was a pretty humbling experience. Here I was convinced I'd built this elegant, sophisticated solution, only to learn the simplest approach was not just better, it took less than an hour to implement. It's just a case of classic premature optimization. I was so focused on theoretical performance problems that didn't exist, I'd lost sight of what actually mattered. And the real damage caused wasn't just the 2 weeks of wasted development time. I created a maintenance nightmare. I burned through the goodwill of my team. And I turned a simple feature into a crisis. And as I reflect on this, something interesting stuck with me. This kind of complexity seems avoidable. It's not like I'd set out to overcomplicate things, though I thought I was doing the right thing. I followed best practices, being a proper developer, trying to figure out how to future-proof the solution. But in hindsight, the whole situation could have just been avoided with some basic forethought and maybe talking to my colleagues first. This led me to a bigger question, because this isn't the first time I've done this. So how do I stop myself from falling into these traps? Before I could answer that, I realized I needed to understand something a bit more fundamental. What is complexity? At its core, something is complex when it has many interconnected parts that are difficult to understand and reason about. Think of a light switch. You flick it up, the lights turn on. Flick it down, the lights turn off. It's quite simple, right? It works by testing exactly 2 states. Software, on the other hand, anything but simple. They can have countless states at any given time. They interact with dozens of any other systems simultaneously, break in ways we could never imagine. They're hard to test, sometimes very hard to describe, and sometimes they feel impossible to monitor. And that is the reality of it. Software systems are inherently complex. We can't avoid that fact, nor can we design it away. Think about a real-time trading system or train traffic control software. These problems are complex by their very nature. Managing thousands of transactions per second or keeping trains from colliding requires complexity. And this is what we call essential complexity, the kind that comes from the problem itself, not from the implementation of it. And it's in the implementation where things can go wrong. In an effort to simplify, we lose sight of the actual problem we're trying to solve. There's a fine line between a good abstraction and a leaky one. And this is where we start to introduce different types of complexity. The unintentional mistakes, the over-engineered solutions, the unnecessary abstractions, and binary trees when a dictionary would do just fine. This is what we call accidental complexity, the extra complexity that we add ourselves. Now, I wish I could say I came up with these brilliant insights myself, but because it would make me feel very smart. But I actually discovered them while reading a fascinating paper called No Silver Bullet, written by Frederick Brooks in 1986. This paper blew my mind for two reasons. Firstly, despite its age, it still felt startlingly relevant, as if it was written weeks ago. Secondly, the differentiation between essential complexity and accidental complexity triggered a light bulb moment for me. I suddenly realized I'd spent a significant portion of my career unconsciously creating accidental complexity instead of focusing on the real business problems. Let me give you an example. At the time, I was venturing into a tech lead role. Me and my team were building mobile applications that integrated with enterprise systems. And we had a real challenge on our hands. We had to maintain feature parity between iOS and Android while simultaneously trying to scale a team. And the problems were just piling up. Clients would ask, why does the iOS app do this, but the Android one doesn't? Bugs would appear on one platform, but not the other. And don't even get me started on those damn storyboard merge conflicts. Feeling out of my depth and desperate for a solution, I dove back into research mode. And that's when I discovered Uberibs. Uberibs is a cross-platform architecture that would let you write native code while sharing business logic. And hey, if Uber's using it, it has to be good, right? Except Uber was designed for hundreds, if not thousands of developers working on the same app simultaneously. We had less than 10. And I think this pattern plays out across our entire industry. We see tech giants like Netflix and Amazon running massively distributed systems with microservices and Kubernetes, and everyone seems to think they suddenly need them as well. Never mind that Netflix is optimizing for streaming to millions of users concurrently, or Amazon has infrastructure needs that most companies would never even come close to. We convince ourselves that what works for them must work for us. And so we introduce accidental complexity for problems we don't have and might not ever have. Which raises a fascinating question. If we know accidental complexity makes our lives harder, why do we keep doing it? It's a tough question. But let's face it, we can't help ourselves. As Neil Ford wellly put, developers are drawn to complexity, like moths to a flame, frequently with the same result. We crave it, we chase it, we convince ourselves we need it, and then act surprised when our solution backfires on us. Honestly, this was probably the hardest part in preparing for this talk. It's very easy to point fingers at complexity and list all of its flaws. We just did that for the last 20 minutes. But having to step back and ask myself, why do I do this? Well, that was much harder. See, why we do what we do is a question that philosophers and scientists have been asking themselves for centuries. So who am I to say why you or anyone else does something like overcomplicate software? I simply just can't. So instead of trying to solve the problems of the human nature, I decided to focus on something a bit more within my control. My own mistakes. I wanted to understand what was really going on beneath the surface when I made these decisions. So let's go back to my fantastically elaborate asset hierarchy that, might I remind you, got deleted. What was really going on there? The context is important. We were bringing on new team members, and as I was transitioning into the tech lead role, whether that was because of my skill or simply because I had the longest tenure at the company, still up for debate, And here I was, dealing with classic imposter syndrome, the nagging feeling that I needed to prove I was smart enough to lead this team, a challenging relationship with my new manager, feeling like I had to justify my very existence to him. If I'm being really honest, a desperate need to show everyone how clever I was. I overcomplicated things because of my ego, plain and simple. I wanted to prove myself. I wanted to feel like I belonged in this new role. And I felt scared. I felt scared that if I didn't impress people, my position may be at risk. And that experience taught me a hard but important lesson. Simplicity just isn't elegant, it's practical. It's about solving the problem the most straightforward way, not the most impressive looking way. And ironically, sometimes the simplest solutions are the ones that earn you the most respect. And something really hit me. We're human. We're complex by design. Could the reason that I complicated things be due to a set of emotions and feelings going on? The more I reflected on this, the more I saw the pattern repeat. Like a time I pushed hard for GraphQL because the way we fetch data on our mobile apps felt outdated. It wasn't modern. It wasn't exciting. And why? Well, I was worried about being left behind. Our tech stack wasn't shiny. It wasn't cutting edge. And a friend of mine, he just got a job at this cool startup that had beer on tap. Like, I felt jealous. Meanwhile, the company I was working at, the most exciting perk we had was a limited supply of Mentos. I wanted to prove we could be innovative too, that we weren't stuck in the past. But in chasing that, I was introducing unnecessary complexity into our team. And the worst part, I wasn't reducing complexity. I was just moving it around. Because complexity doesn't just disappear. Like when I needed to simplify our architecture with ribs, I only ended up creating a coordination nightmare. But when you break up a monolith, deciding to make things simpler or improve scalability, only to introduce a whole new set of complexities with microservices, some of which you then try to fix with Kubernetes, leading to orchestration headaches, and eventually you find yourself lost at sea drowning in YAML files. And going back to that paper written by Fred Brooks, he said there's no silver bullet. There's no magic solution in software development that's going to solve all your problems. And yet, in our pursuit for better tools and fancy abstractions, we lose sight in the essence of the true problems we're trying to solve. We chase complexity thinking it will future-proof our systems, when in reality, we're just shifting the problem elsewhere. So choose your complexity wisely, because sometimes it's just the wrong tool for the job. But let's be real. Not all forms of accidental complexity are avoidable. Sometimes you just don't know better. You make a decision with the best information you had at the time, and only to realize later that you were wrong. And that's okay. You're human. That's how we learn. So after all, there's one thing I have realized, is that the reasons that why I've overcomplicated things weren't just technical. They were deeply human, driven by fear, ego, and insecurity. But recognizing these emotions, that was the first step to finding a better path. So how do we fight our tendency to overcomplicate things? I wish I could stand here and say I have all the answers, but I don't, and I'm sorry to disappoint on that. I do have some thoughts and simple practices that have really helped me. Firstly, remember those classic principles we conveniently forget when trying to be clever. Yagni, You ain't gonna need it. The next time you catch yourself trying to cram in some feature that wasn't part of the spec, but you think it needs to be done because what if X happens, maybe stop and ask yourself, do I really need this? Or KISS. Keep it simple, stupid. Honestly, I feel like my mum taught me this one. Do I really need to explain it much further? Principles alone aren't enough, though. We're good at justifying complexity to ourselves. That's why not working in isolation is crucial. I'm a firm believer in collaborative software development. When we're left to our own devices, it's too easy to over-engineer solutions and convince ourselves they're necessary. Practices like mob programming might feel inefficient and very weird at first, trust me, but having teammates ask why every 5 minutes is probably one of the best complexity detectors I've ever found. An old boss of mine used to say, if you can't explain something to your grandmother, you probably don't understand it well enough. So if you can't explain something to your teammates as why you need to do something, you probably don't need it. Similarly, techniques like event storming from domain-driven design help teams focus on the real problems instead of getting bogged down in the technical hypotheticals. And additionally, here are some lessons that have taken me far too long to learn. Don't start with an abstraction. Let them emerge naturally. The best ones feel obvious at the time. So when you see yourself reaching for something like a repository pattern, even though you're already using entity framework, stop and ask yourself, why? It's okay to repeat yourself sometimes. I used to take dry as a gospel, avoiding repetition at all costs. But extreme dry introduces coupling, and coupling can breed complexity. You end up connecting parts of code that were once isolated. So you need to be careful with this. Favor readability over cleverness. Trust me, I know how satisfying it is to turn 10 lines of code into one, but then the next day, you can't even remember what that one line of code was meant to do. So maybe just don't do it. Make it easier for your teammates, not just yourself. Most importantly, be mindful. Keep asking yourself, what am I truly trying to achieve here? Because at the end of the day, it's not about proving how clever you are. It's about building software to help people. And funny enough, that's what's led me back to the joy of coding. We've been on a small journey today, from my embarrassing over-engineering stories to learning about accidental complexity, exploring the human elements behind it, and finding ways to fight our tendencies to make things more complicated. In the end, software is inherently complex, and that is not going away. But as Einstein once said, make things as simple as possible, but not simpler. And I'll be honest, I still catch myself overcomplicating things, but now I'm aware of it. Writing simple code is hard. It requires confidence to do less and courage to say, that's good enough. But your future self and your team will thank you for it. So when I started preparing for this talk, I wanted to understand why software development just feels so much harder than when I had started. And what I realized is that complexity of software isn't just about the code. It's about us, the humans working on it. So while some complexity is unavoidable, much of what makes our work difficult is self-imposed. Born from wanting to prove ourselves, chasing trends, feeling irrelevant, or simply making mistakes. Remember the pure joy of making something work when you first started coding? It's not gone. It's just buried under layers of self-imposed complexity. By embracing true simplicity and working collaboratively, I've rediscovered what makes software development truly rewarding for me. And maybe, just maybe, by giving ourselves permission to be simple, to solve the problem in front of us, rather than the ones that we imagine might have use someday, you can find joy again too. Thank you, everyone. You got any thoughts?